A messenger arrives in a provincial town on horseback, dust on his cloak, and he does not wait to catch his breath. He unrolls a scroll in the town square and reads it aloud to whoever gathers. It is news from Rome. A new emperor has taken the throne, or a great victory has been won on some distant frontier. And the word used for this kind of announcement is euangelion, good news, except it is not good news in the soft, sentimental sense we might mean today. It is an official proclamation backed by the full weight of the empire, and it demands a response. You either accept the news and adjust your life around it, or you are a problem to be dealt with. Now picture a different scene. A man in first-century Judea sits down or dictates to a scribe and begins to write. And the very first sentence he writes is this: the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That word gospel, euangelion, is the same word the messenger used in the town square. This is not an accident. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because the entire book that follows is written like a Roman imperial announcement, borrowing its vocabulary, its structure, and even its climactic formula, and using all of it to make a claim that would have been considered treason. Most people read the Gospel of Mark as a fast-moving biography, short sentences, quick scenes. Jesus healing here, teaching there, moving on before the dust settles. And that is true. But it is not the whole truth. Mark is not just writing quickly because he is in a hurry to cover material. He is writing in the style of an official dispatch and the shape of his book. From its opening line to its final scene at the cross follows the pattern of a Roman announcement almost point for point. We are going to walk through that pattern together, starting with a single word moving through the architecture of the whole book, and ending at a scene on a hill outside Jerusalem, where a Roman soldier says something that would have gotten him executed if he meant it about anyone but Caesar. Let us start with that word, euangelion. In everyday Greek before the New Testament, this word was already doing very specific work, and it was not primarily a religious word. Archaeologists found an inscription in the ancient city of Priene, in what is now Western Turkey, dated to around 9 BC. It is a calendar decree, and it describes the birthday of Caesar Augustus as the beginning of good news, euangelia, for the whole world, because his birth marked the start of a new era of peace. The inscription calls Augustus a savior who has put an end to war and brought order to everything. This was not a private letter. This was carved in stone, displayed publicly, meant to be read by everyone in the province. The emperor's birth, his accession, his victories, these were the events that got called gospel in the ancient world. So when Mark opens his book with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he is not inventing new religious vocabulary. He is picking up a term already loaded with imperial meaning and pointing it somewhere else entirely. The word Son of God makes this even sharper. By the time Mark was writing, Roman emperors had been using the title Son of the Divine One, Divi Filius, on coins and inscriptions for decades, starting with Augustus, who claimed the title because his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, had been officially declared a god by the Roman Senate after his death. Every coin that passed through a Judean marketplace likely carried some version of that claim. Caesar, Son of God. And Mark, in his very first sentence, applies that same title to a Galilean carpenter's son, who will end the book nailed to a Roman cross. That is not a small literary choice. That is the thesis of the entire book stated in the first 9 words. Here is what most people miss when they read past that opening line too quickly. Ancient announcements, whether they were imperial decrees or military dispatches, tended to follow a recognizable pattern. They opened with a title or heading identifying what kind of document this was. They established the credentials of the one being announced. They described the deeds that proved those credentials. And they built toward a climactic declaration, often delivered by someone in a position of authority, confirming the identity of the one being honored. Mark's gospel follows this same shape, and once you know to look for it, the architecture of the whole book comes into focus. The opening chapter functions like the credentials section of an imperial announcement. Before Jesus does anything, Mark stacks up authorities who vouch for him. The prophet Isaiah is quoted connecting Jesus to centuries of Jewish expectation. John the Baptist appears described in language that echoes Elijah, and he explicitly says, "Someone greater is coming after him." Then at the baptism itself, a voice from heaven speaks, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." In the space of 13 verses, Mark has assembled prophetic scripture, a forerunner's testimony, and a direct declaration from heaven itself. This is not how you open a casual biography. This is how you open an official proclamation. The credentials are established before the man has spoken a single public word. And then the pace changes, and this is where Mark's Greek style becomes its own kind of evidence. The word euthys, usually translated immediately or at once, appears more than 40 times in Mark's Gospel, more than in the other 3 Gospels combined. Scene after scene begins with it. Immediately he saw the heavens opened. Immediately the Spirit drove him into the wilderness. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Think about the rhythm of a messenger's dispatch from a battlefield meant to be read quickly, packed with events moving the listener from one piece of news to the next without lingering. That is the rhythm Mark builds. He is not writing meditative prose meant to be savored slowly. He is writing a rapid, breathless report, event after event, each one landing before the last has fully settled. The way news from the front lines might arrive to a Roman official, who needed the facts fast and needed to know what they meant for the empire. If this is helping you see the Gospel of Mark in a way you have not seen it before, help us get this to someone else. Subscribe, leave a comment, share it with a friend. That is how more people find this. There is another feature of Mark's Gospel that fits this pattern, and that most readers pass over without a second thought, and that is what scholars often call the messianic secret. Again and again, right after a demonstration of power, Jesus tells people not to talk about it. He heals a leper in chapter 1 and sternly warns him to say nothing to anyone. He casts out demons who correctly identify him as the Son of God, and he silences them before they can say more. He raises a synagogue's official's daughter from death in chapter 5 and commands that no one should know it. This looks strange if you are reading Mark as a straightforward biography meant to build public reputation as fast as possible, but it makes complete sense if you are reading it as a controlled announcement. Official Roman proclamations were not released the moment news happened. They were held verified and released at the appointed time through the appointed channel in the appointed form. An emperor's death and his successor's accession were not simply shouted into the street the instant they occurred. They were managed, confirmed, and then announced formally, often with real political stakes riding on getting the timing right. Mark's Jesus operates the same way. The full truth of who he is will not be released piecemeal through scattered rumors and half-informed crowds. It will be confirmed fully and finally at the cross through the mouth of a Roman witness. At the moment, Mark has been building toward from his very first sentence. Once the credentials are established and the pace is set, Mark's first half, roughly chapters 1 through 8, becomes an escalating demonstration of authority. Jesus casts out demons and the crowds ask, "What new doctrine is this?" For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him. Jesus heals a paralyzed man and forgives his sins in the same breath. And the religious leaders accuse him of blasphemy because only God can forgive sins. Jesus calms a storm with a word and his own disciples ask each other, "Who can this be that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Every single episode in this first half is building toward one question: who is this man? It is the same question a province would ask about a newly announced ruler. What are his credentials? What has he actually done that proves the claim? And the first half of Mark's Gospel reaches its hinge point at exactly the halfway mark in chapter 8 at a place called Caesar Philippi. Notice the name of the location: Caesarea, named for Caesar; Philippi, named for the ruler Philip who built it up in Caesar's honor. It is soaked in imperial branding, a city built specifically to celebrate Roman power. And it is here, of all places, that Jesus turns to his disciples and asks the credentials question directly. "Who do men say that I am?" And after they list a few options, prophets and forerunners, he narrows it. "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answers, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed king." Here is the detail that changes everything. In a Roman announcement, once the credentials are established and the identity is confirmed, the next section typically describes the ruler's power and his coming reign, usually cast in terms of triumph, dominance, and the extension of his kingdom. This is precisely where Mark's Gospel does something the Roman genre never does. Immediately after Peter's confession, Jesus begins to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, be killed, and rise again after 3 days. Peter, still thinking in the categories of imperial triumph, rebukes him for saying it. And Jesus rebukes Peter back sharper than almost anywhere else in the Gospel. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." This is the moment the entire structure of Mark's Gospel pivots on, and it is worth sitting with for a second. Mark has spent 8 chapters building Jesus up, using the exact template of imperial announcement, credentials, authority, growing acclaim, all pointing toward the confirmation that this is the king. And the instant that confirmation lands, Mark takes the genre and turns it inside out. This king's coming triumph will not look like a Roman triumph. It will look like a Roman execution. Think of it like reading a coronation announcement that ends not with a crown being placed on a head, but with that same head bowed under the weight of a criminal's cross. That is the shock the original audience would have felt, because they knew exactly what an imperial announcement was supposed to promise, and Mark was rewriting the ending in real time. The second half of Mark's Gospel, chapters 8 through 16, is no longer building the case for who Jesus is. That question was settled at Caesar Philippi. Now, the question becomes what kind of king he actually is. And every scene from here forward reframes power itself. James and John ask for the seats of honor next to Jesus in his glory, expecting the usual arrangement of imperial court politics. And Jesus tells them, "Whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." This is a direct rewriting of what kingship means. Roman rulers ruled by being served. This king rules by serving and ultimately by dying. And then Mark walks the reader into Jerusalem, and the imperial parody becomes almost impossible to miss if you know what you are looking at. Jesus enters the city not on a war horse the way a conquering general would enter after a campaign, but on a young donkey, fulfilling the prophecy in Zechariah of a king who comes lowly and riding on a donkey. The crowds shout, "Hosanna," which literally means "save now," and they lay down branches and garments, the kind of welcome typically reserved for a returning military hero. It has the shape of a Roman triumphal entry and none of the substance. No legions, no spoils of war, no captives in chains, just a man on a borrowed animal heading toward a cross rather than a palace. Think about what an actual Roman triumph looked like, the real ceremony this scene is quietly parodying. When a Roman general won a major campaign, the Senate could grant him a triumph, a formal procession through the streets of Rome itself. The general rode a chariot through cheering crowds. Behind him came the spoils of war, captured treasure. And often the defeated enemy commander in chains paraded publicly before being executed once the ceremony ended. A slave was sometimes said to stand behind the general in the chariot, whispering a reminder that he was mortal. That glory like this could turn to dust. It was the single most visible display of Roman power a citizen could witness in a lifetime. Jesus enters Jerusalem doing the exact opposite of every element of that ceremony. No chariot, only a borrowed donkey. No captured spoils, only children and the poor singing psalms. No enemy in chains at the rear of the procession, only crowds laying down their own garments in the road. And rather than a triumph that ends with an execution imposed on someone else, this procession ends days later with the one being celebrated being executed himself. Mark seems to know exactly what a triumph is supposed to look like, and he is showing his readers event by event everything this procession refuses to be. The trial and crucifixion scenes in Mark's final chapters are where the Roman imperial vocabulary reaches its sharpest, most deliberate turn. Pilate asks Jesus directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answers, "It is as you say." The soldiers then stage what can only be described as a mock coronation. They dress him in a purple robe, the color reserved for royalty and worn by emperors and triumphant generals. They twist together a crown not of gold or laurel, but of thorns, and press it onto his head. They kneel before him and mock him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And when they crucify him, Pilate has a sign placed above his head written in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic, so that everyone passing by in every major language of the empire can read it, "The King of the Jews." That trilingual placard, called a titulus, was standard Roman practice for publicly stating the crime of the condemned. It was meant to warn onlookers away from whatever offense had earned this punishment. A public service announcement of sorts, functioning much like the imperial inscriptions that announced Caesar's honors, except aimed at deterrence instead of celebration. Rome is without meaning to issuing its own official proclamation. And the proclamation meant as mockery turns out to be exactly true. Think of it like a forged document that turns out against all odds to contain the real signature. The soldiers dress Jesus in purple as a joke. They press thorns into his scalp as cruelty dressed up as comedy. They nail a sign above his head meant to humiliate him publicly in 3 languages so that no one passing by could miss the mockery. And every single detail they intended as parody, the robe, the crown, the public inscription naming him king, turns out in Mark's telling to be the truest coronation ceremony in the entire book. The empire that specialized in manufacturing official announcements accidentally manufactured the most accurate one it ever produced, and it did not even know it was doing it. If you have ever felt like the version of strength the world sells you, winning, dominating, never appearing weak, does not match what you actually see modeled in your own life or in the lives of people you admire most. This is the part of the story that was written for exactly that tension. And then comes the final piece of the pattern, the part of a Roman announcement that confirms everything that came before it. Ancient proclamations often climaxed with a formal declaration, sometimes from a witness, sometimes from an official confirming the identity and status of the one being honored. Mark places this confirmation in the least likely mouth imaginable. As Jesus breathes his last on the cross, a Roman centurion, a career soldier who has almost certainly overseen dozens of crucifixions and has no reason to feel anything but professional indifference, watches him die and says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Here is the detail that should stop you cold. That title, Son of God, is the exact imperial title stamped on Roman coins for Caesar. A Roman military officer standing at the foot of a cross in the uniform of the empire that claimed that title for its own emperor applies it instead to the executed man in front of him. This is the climactic confirmation the whole book has been building toward since its opening sentence. And Mark places it in the mouth of the one person whose testimony Rome itself would have had to take seriously. Not a disciple, not a follower with something to gain. A Roman soldier doing his job looking at a corpse and saying the one sentence that undoes the entire imperial claim Rome had built its identity around. It is worth pausing on just how administratively precise Mark is willing to be, because precision like this was itself a feature of official Roman documents. Mark names Pontius Pilate specifically the actual governor of Judea at the time, a detail that ties the entire narrative to a fixed point in verifiable Roman administrative history rather than a vague legendary past. He names the place of the crucifixion Golgotha and translates it for his readers, the place of a skull. He records the exact timing of events using the Roman method of marking hours, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour. The kind of precise administrative timestamping you would expect in an official report, not in a folktale passed down by campfire. Roman announcements were not vague. They named names, dates, and places because they were meant to be checked against reality. Mark writes the same way, and that specificity is itself a quiet claim. This happened in this place under this governor at these hours, and you are free to go verify it. This pattern does not exist in isolation. It reaches back into the Hebrew scriptures that shaped Mark's own imagination. The prophet Daniel describes one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven and being given dominion glory and a kingdom that will never be destroyed in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Isaiah's servant songs describe a figure who is despised and rejected, who is wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities in Isaiah chapter 53. Psalm 22, written centuries before crucifixion existed as a Roman practice, describes hands and feet being pierced, and the sufferer's garments being divided by casting lots. Details Mark records almost verbatim happening at the foot of the cross. Mark is not simply borrowing Roman vocabulary to make a clever literary point. He is showing that the Hebrew scriptures had already described exactly this kind of king centuries before Rome existed as an empire at all, and that the Roman genre of imperial announcement, when it collided with that older, deeper story, could not help but confirm it even in mockery. There is real historical weight behind treating this connection as more than coincidence. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, records how thoroughly Roman imperial ideology, including emperor worship, had saturated life in the provinces where Mark's earliest readers lived. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, still refers to Christ's execution under Pontius Pilate as a matter of public record, treating it as an established fact of Roman administrative history, not a rumor. These writers were not friendly to the Christian movement, and yet their casual references confirm the basic historical scaffolding Mark builds his gospel around. A real execution under a real governor in a real province soaked in real imperial propaganda. Mark was not writing in a vacuum. He was writing directly into a world that already knew what an imperial announcement sounded like. And he was counting on his readers to notice exactly what he was doing with it. If this kind of study, tracing the way Scripture speaks directly into its own historical moment, is something that matters to you, consider joining as a channel member, or simply take a second to share this with someone who loves digging into the text as much as you do. 4 chapters that read like credentials being established. A hinge point at a city built to honor Caesar where the real king is finally named. A second half that rewrites everything. The first half seemed to promise about triumph. A procession into Jerusalem that borrows every element of a Roman victory parade and inverts every one of them. A mock coronation that turns out to be the real one. and a Roman soldier of all people delivering the one line of confirmation. The entire book has been quietly building towards since its very first sentence. So what does this mean for you right now, reading this centuries later? In a world that no longer has Roman centurions or imperial coinage, but still runs on the same basic instinct Mark was writing against. First, notice how easily we still measure greatness by domination, and how thoroughly Mark's gospel refuses that measurement from its very first sentence to its very last. If you have ever assumed that God's power has to look like winning in the way the world defines winning, unmistakable, unchallenged, impossible to mock, this is the gospel that was written to correct that assumption at the root. The king it announces wins through a cross, not despite one. Second, notice where the confirmation of Jesus' identity actually comes from in Mark's story. Not from a friendly crowd, not from a disciple with everything to gain by saying it. It comes from an outsider, a Roman soldier with every institutional reason to say nothing at all, standing at the one moment that looked by every worldly measure like total defeat. If you have ever wondered whether your own lowest moment, the one that felt like the opposite of victory, could still be the place where something true about you or about God gets seen most clearly, this is the scene in the Bible that answers that question directly. There is a third thing worth sitting with here too. Think about a stone dropped into still water. The moment it breaks the surface, rings begin to spread outward further and further long after the stone itself has disappeared beneath the water. Mark's gospel works the same way. It was written into a specific moment, addressed to readers who understood exactly what an imperial evangelion sounded like, and exactly what the title Son of God was supposed to mean when stamped on a coin. That specific moment is long gone. The stone disappeared centuries ago, but the rings are still spreading. Every time someone reads this gospel and realizes that the king it announces rules through service instead of domination, through a cross instead of a chariot, another ring moves outward from that same original point of impact. You reading this right now in whatever situation you are in, are simply standing in one more ring of water, still moving from a stone dropped 2,000 years ago. In a Roman province, most people at the time would have considered an unimportant backwater. And maybe the part that stays with me most is this: Mark did not have to write his gospel this way. He could have told the story of Jesus using any literary shape available to him in the first century. He chose deliberately word by word the shape of a Roman imperial proclamation, the exact genre his readers would have recognized instantly, and he filled it with the king who serves instead of being served, who enters a city on a donkey instead of a war horse, whose crown is thorns instead of gold, and whose confirming witness is a soldier standing over a body rather than a crowd cheering a coronation. 2,000 years later, empires that issued their own euangelia, their own announcements of good news, are gone, remembered mostly in inscriptions dug out of the ground by archaeologists. And the announcement Mark wrote borrowed language, and all is still being read aloud. If this opens something up for you, help us reach someone else with it. Subscribe, leave a comment. Even one word helps more people find this. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Pray for us. God bless you.